Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 13. Hope you had a great spring break and you're ready to kick it out here the last 3 or 4 weeks of the semester and have a good time. We're going to start that process today by talking about justice and war. I'm going to present to you three Christian views, or views that I should say were standard at one point in the history of Judeo-Christian thinking. That would be holy war, pacifism, and just war, and also three secular views, just briefly on these three. And these include pragmatism, realpolitik, and militarism. Okay, we're going to start with the Old Testament, where we find most of our material about holy war. In the Old Testament, the story that sort of dominates the history parts of it is the relationship of God with his covenant people in Israel. And that really picks up, the story really picks up when the Israelites are moving out of Egypt and back towards Canaan, the promised land, where they, as a group, a large body of people, are going to settle. And that causes some strife. Some of the people don't want them there, and so they attack them. And once the Israelites get there, they apparently need to clean out some of the areas of Canaanites and their idol worship so that they can have them for themselves. There's a little bit of an ethnic cleansing that goes on there, all under the direction of God. The key thing about this is that God apparently expects the Israelites to go to war when God says so and at no other time, and to conduct that war as God says and in no other way, and that the Israelites are not going to be able to know in advance what God is going to ask them to do. This last part is very important. Israel is not going to know in advance. So God says to them several times, do not get into a situation where you're raising a standing army and you will then rely on your army and not on me. You rely on your horses and chariots, as he puts it in some places, rather than on God. So God does not want a system where there's a standing army. This is one of his main warnings against Israel becoming a monarchy. The Israelites in early Samuel are complaining that they don't have the kinds of leadership that the other countries around them have. So they want a king just like the other countries. And God says, you're going to get, if I give you a king, you're going to get all these other things you don't want, including a standing army that's going to be taxing you all the time, taking your wealth and taking your young men and sending the wars where they might not come back. That's not what you should be doing. You should be relying on me. Well, what does it look like when Israel relies on Jesus, on God alone? Well, sometimes it looks like Gideon and the story of his when he was a judge before the kings in Israel, after the Israelites had already settled there. There are some enemies that need to be dealt with, and God says, "Yeah, we're going to have to fight them." And so Gideon goes out and raises a huge army, and God says, "No, no, no, that's too many. I don't need all that. I just need a few hundred." And he helps Gideon sort of winnow it all out, most of those soldiers, and send them home. They don't even fight. And the ones that are left, God says, "Okay, here's what I want you to get. Each guy needs a pitcher. Each guy needs a torch. That's all you need. We don't need swords. We don't need other weapons. We don't need, archers or anything. That's what we need." And they surround the enemy at night. The enemy's camped in a valley. They're in the hillsides around them. And all at once they break down, throw down their pitchers and make a huge noise. And they light their torches. And the enemy is confused, thinking it's being invaded. And all the enemy soldiers start fighting each other in the dark, and they wipe each other out. The Israelites don't have to do anything. That was God's idea of a war in that case. In another case where the Philistines are giving them trouble, the Israelites have raised their army and they're ready to face the Philistines in battle, but the Philistines have this Goliath and everybody's afraid of him. And God says, "No, you got it. You're doing this all wrong. Go get this shepherd boy, this one guy who knows how to use a sling. Have him fight Goliath." So David kills Goliath with his sling. The army is useless. That's God's idea. Those are kind of funny in a way and also kind of encouraging, but there's also discouraging examples. Sometimes God told the Israelites to wipe out everybody in a village, not just the men, women and children too. Then in a particular case, King Saul, the first of the kings, after the Israelites get God to give him a king, Saul's doing okay, I guess. And then along the way, God says, "You need to wipe out this village, and I need you to wipe out everyone in it." Saul understands this, but he can't bring himself to order the killing of the women and the children. So many of them survive. But God says, "You didn't do what I told you to do. You're no longer king." Sooner or later, David's going to replace you. That's holy war. You fight when God says, not any other time. You fight using the methods God says, not any other way. There's really no point in storing up stuff because you don't know what you're going to be using. God will figure it out on the scene. That's holy war. And notice it's kind of anybody. Gideon is not an official in the government or anything when he's called by God to raise an army. He becomes the prophet, the judge, not the prophet, the judge at that time because of the call, because he responded to the call, but he wasn't already the judge. And so it could be a private citizen. All right. So we get to the New Testament, and there's quite a different emphasis. At one point, Peter arms himself to defend Jesus. This is towards the end of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus is about to be arrested, and they kind of know he might be set up on charges and he might be killed. And Peter wants to defend him with a sword, and Jesus says, "Put that sword away. Who lives by the sword dies by the sword." Instead, Jesus says, "Love your enemies." Now, how are we going to love our enemies? Can we love an enemy while killing them? While killing them? Jesus didn't make exceptions for soldiers or enemy combatants. He says, love your enemies, period. There's no carve out. So that enemy you meet on the field of battle, you're supposed to be loving them. I've heard people say that they're capable of loving an enemy and then kill him. It's a mind boggler for me. And it's mind boggler for a lot of people. This is why in the early days of the Christian faith, most Christians were pacifists and would not kill. Some were in the army and they went to jail or even were executed for not killing. Some were in the army when they converted and stayed in the army, and the church tolerated that. So there was a difference of opinion, but the majority opinion, the predominant opinion during the first 300 years of Christianity was that we were to be pacifists. Now, it is clear, it is true that those Christians were never in charge of anything. They weren't emperors or whatever. So in a way, they weren't necessarily as responsible for the welfare of their neighbors as somebody in authority was. And so when Constantine in the year 312 is converted to Christianity, just as he's about to rid Rome of an evil tyrant, he doesn't stop the battle. He's got an army there. He's equipped. He's got soldiers, and he's got a bad guy in Rome from his point of view, and he needs to do something about it. But on the eve of the battle, he sees a vision of a cross in the sky and a sign that says, "Under this cross, conquer." And so he has his soldiers put a cross on their shields, and they are actually acting as if they're Christians, or proclaiming a Christian deity, which becomes official after Constantine ends up winning control of the entire empire. He makes Christianity the official language of the state. So now Christians are in charge of public order and defense against enemies, which they see as service in their neighbors, loving their neighbors. They love their neighbors, and so they want them to have peaceful, orderly lives. We've seen from, forgot his name for a second, Thomas Hobbes, how bad it is to live in a disordered time. And they are aware of that. So they think their duty is to love their neighbors and preserve order and defend the empire. How do they square that with loving their enemies? It is not an easy answer, and theologians struggled around this for a while. Augustine, about 100 years after Constantine, comes up with the first sort of fully rounded theory of just war, which gets refined, especially by Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s, in the 13th century, almost 1,000 years later. And it's still the predominant view of most churches and many politicians in the West, and Europe, and most of the world now, actually. If you ask them, they mostly would say they were just war theorists, if they thought about it at all. Just war has two main categories, classically. The first is jus ad bellum, J-U-S-A-D-B-E-L-L-U-M, jus ad bellum, which means just cause. You can only go to war for just causes. I'll explain more about that in a minute. And then when you're in the war, you look at the categories of jus ad bello, jus, J-U-S-A-D, BELLO, which means justice in the war while you're conducting the war. How you conduct the war has standards too. There's also a category called jus post bellum, which has to do with conditions after the war. I'm not going to get into that today, but I'm going to concentrate on these other two, which are the classic two: jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So jus ad bellum has different numbers, but several requirements, which I'll recite for you. The first is that the cause has to be just. Some things are not just causes. Revenge is not a just cause because the harm is already done. That doesn't mean you're right to spew harm on others, including soldiers who may not have had anything on the other enemy who had nothing to do with the harm individually. You don't have right to kill people to correct the harm. That's one. Revenge is not one. Territory or other kinds of material gains, that's not a just cause. Pride or honor are not just causes. Only just cause is justice and prevention of harm. Doing justice, preventing injustice mostly, and preventing harm as one of the injustices you're trying to prevent. So that has to be your goal, to stop the killing, stop suffering, preventing harm being done. Second is proper authority. It cannot be just anybody who declares war. And it's only probably in most places one agency that's allowed to declare war, and that's the sovereign. In a monarchy, it'd be the king. Popes and bishops and mayors cannot just declare war. Only the king. In a democracy, it'd be whatever the democratic rule, the Constitution has designated. In our country, it'd be Congress and possibly the president between them might have the just war, the authority to declare war. Mayors and governors do not. You and I do not. Your Sunday school class does not. No guy named Gideon who thinks he might be a judge can declare war. It's only the established authority. Right? Intention, again, I think that just comes under just cause largely, but it has to do with what your immediate intention is in the war. If it's to seize territory, not right. Or resources, not right. To establish your honor, not right. Okay, that's three. Last resort, very important one, because we're loving the enemy. We want the enemy to have every chance to live out the life that God gave them. We can only use war as the last resort. We can't use it as a first resort or an early resort or kind of a middle late resort. It has to be the last resort. This is a very hard one to enforce because it doesn't mean that you have to wait until you actually been obliterated. It doesn't mean when the last person standing. It means the last resort has been interpreted, I think, kind of reasonably to mean practically the last resort. It doesn't mean when you start to have risks. That's not it. It probably means when you start to, you're in danger of losing the capacity to achieve the just result. So you're starting to undertake significant casualties or something like that. Last resort's hard to define, and people on the field would probably define it as having expired earlier than people sitting back in the safety of homes, and it's hard to know which of those two is right. Reasonable chance of success. This is the fifth one, reasonable chance of success. You can't, there's no such thing as a hopeless cause being a just war. There's no death first. That's Princess Bride. No, never give up, never surrender. That's Galaxy Quest. No fighting to the last man. Alamo. These are not reasonable chances of success. Once the reasonable chance of success expires, you stop killing people because they don't deserve to die. You stop taking death yourself. Once the reasonable chance of success is evaporated. And your ultimate goal of the whole thing has to be peace. You can't do a series of these. It can't be endless war. The goal is to reestablish a peace in which there's some sense of justice and people are not dying. So just cause, proper authority, right intention to the degree it's different than just cause, last resort, reasonable chance of success, ultimate goal is peace. That's 6 categories of things you need to look for under jus ad bellum. When you get to jus in bello, then you're talking about the conduct of war. The first of those criteria is military necessity. We need to, everything we do has to be necessary for the military cause. No sort of excursions over here to wipe out some people just because, whatever. If it's not a military cause, even though those might be soldiers over there, you're not supposed to go get them if there's no military purpose for it. That applies also to destruction of property and things like that. Only for military purposes. No random shooting after you've subdued a population, all that kind of stuff, okay? Number two, proportionality. Don't have a big war over a tiny cause. If somebody's incurred a mile into your territory, you don't get to wipe out the country. It's got to be proportionality to the need, and to the offense, to the danger that you're trying to stop. You don't want to do more harm stopping a small danger than the danger itself, if possible. Third, distinction between combatants and non-combatants. This is really crucial and another really tough one. So classically, the people who are in uniform and in regular members of the armed forces of the enemy are fair game. They're out to kill you, you have a right to kill them, or vice versa, whichever. They're in the game, they are targets. But there are, particularly modern war, but it's also been true in a lot of wars, it's really hard to distinguish between the combatants and the non-combatants. So if a soldier takes off his uniform and continues fighting, that is a war crime, because now you're erasing the barrier, the distinction between the combatants and the non-combatants. And the other side, they don't have to take casualties from you just because you're not in a uniform. So they're allowed to kill you, but how do they know who's in the combatant and who isn't when you do that? Or when you put your base under a hospital. This is something that the Hamas has done in Gaza. They deny it, but those aren't credible denials. And so the Israelis have felt they were justified in attacking those bases, but the hospital itself is a civilian thing. So hiding amongst civilians is a war crime, but also can be attacking those posts if you're not discriminate to the maximum you can be, not to be attacking civilians. And so both the Israelis charged with indiscriminate fighting and Hamas charged with hiding amongst civilians are committing war crimes possibly, because they're not paying attention to that crucial distinction between civilians and non-civilians. The other way it shows up is when you have weapons of mass destruction. They are very effective against military forces, but they tend to slop over into civilian populations. Most just war theorists say that's terrible, but it's okay because it's not intended. It's not the intended consequence. The intended consequence over here, there's this other effect. And it's regrettable, but it's not a moral crime. Some just war theorists don't think that way. They think that anytime we get any more than just the very minimal civilian casualties, that could be a war crime. So the firebombing of Dresden by the Allied forces in Europe in World War II, or the earlier attacks the Germans made on London, those would be war crimes, because most of the people suffering there were civilians and everybody knew it, and they did it anyway. It's hard to not say they were targeting civilians in effect, possibly for morale purposes. Similar for the atomic bombings in Japan. There are people who consider those to be war crimes because most of the casualties predictably were civilians. How were you not targeting civilians when you were willing for most of the casualties to be civilians? Difficult questions. Okay. Distinction. And those three, I said four, there's three: military necessity, proportionality, and distinction between combatants and non-combatants are the three big standard use in bellow. All right, those are the three. And nowadays, of course, most Christians who claim a war ethic are just war theorists. A minority are pacifists, hardly any are holy war. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who was a pacifist, when he started his ministry right after World War I in Germany, abandoned pacifism by the time he died in favor of holy war, not just war, because he was willing to enter a conspiracy to kill Hitler. That's by private citizens, not just war. And he did it because he felt he was directly commanded by God to do so, and that he could not disobey God. That's a holy war view. Very, very rare these days amongst Christians. Okay, the three secular ones. We go much more quickly here. The pragmatic view is, yeah, that's all nice about that just war stuff and all that, but we're going to do what makes sense for us to do, and we'll go to war when we're pretty sure we can win. Usually pretty sure we can win, not always thinking about all the victims on the other side. The pragmatic view is war is an instrument of policy, and we'll use it when it makes sense. That is probably the predominant view. Sometimes people acting as pragmatists try to dress up as just war theorists, but they really are arguing for war because it makes sense from our point of view to do this. That's one. And then they wouldn't go to war if it doesn't make sense. There's no principle for going to war. You do it when it works for you, and you don't when it don't. A more extreme version of that is realpolitik. Realpolitik, spelled with a K at the end, is a view that says every nation, every international actor, but particularly nations, you can count on them to act in their own self-interest. And their own self-interest is mostly about security and power. It's for their own survival. That's how you survive, is by being stronger than everybody else. And so you can count on every international actor, terrorist group, whatever, to act as they see necessary for their own survival. And you better do the same or you're going to get wiped out. It goes a little bit beyond pragmatism, and then it makes this assumption that ultimately people will kill you if they get a chance and if they can get away with it. Or at least take all your stuff away from you, whatever, that you don't really count. Whatever counts as them. You can see how a pragmatist and a realpolitik, there might not be a sharp line between the two. The third is militarism. And this is sort of a different approach entirely in that it glorifies war itself as a good thing, as a thing that builds character in its participants, those who survive. Maybe they even think that it helps weed out the ones that don't survive. A little bit of survival of the fittest accelerated for the good of humanity in the gene pool. But more often just in the terms of glorifying war as a place where people learn and master virtues like honor and sacrifice and toughness and willingness to serve on behalf of others. Some of these are very good virtues. And a militarist would say, well, yeah, they're good. And the best way to get them is to go to war, sometimes, or participate in war. Sometimes Teddy Roosevelt used to talk like this, probably amongst the American presidents. He's the most famous for being kind of a militarist and exalting the virtues that one acquires by participating in battle. A best example I know about the same era, this is a little over 100 years ago, you can see examples of it if you go to Berlin to the Kurfürstendamm, which is in the old West Berlin, and there's a church there called the Gedankenkirche, as I recall, which was bombed out partly during World War II, but the narthex, the entryway, survived. And in there you can see mosaics and bas-relief and other things of celebrating the military valor of the Germans around 1900. And in those images, you see Christ blessing the Kaiser and others as sort of his knights. That's the Christian view of militarism. And it never really goes away. There are people who think in those terms now. It's sort of an exaggeration of the honor we probably should give to the people who make sacrifices for us, but it treats the war itself, the fighting itself, as the source of that. All right, those are our 6 views of war, 3 of them which I've identified with the history of our faith, going back to the Old Testament, and 3 of which I identify with secular. I think those are tools you can use to help respond to questions and maybe write a nice introspection. Have a great week.